Margaret Ellison had lived in the small blue house at the end of Cedar Lane for 43 years. She moved in as a young wife, raised 2 children there, and buried her husband from the same front porch where they once drank lemonade on summer evenings. At 70 years old, with silver hair and careful steps, the house was more than shelter, it was memory itself. The letter from the HOA arrived on a Tuesday morning. Notice of eviction, it read, citing unpaid fees, unauthorized modifications, and non-compliance with community standards. Margaret reread it 3 times, her hands trembling. She had paid every bill she'd ever received. The so-called violations were absurd. A rose trellis her husband built decades earlier, a mailbox deemed out of date, a property line dispute she'd never heard of. When she went to the HOA office, the board barely looked up. The president, a sharp-voiced woman half Margaret's age, spoke slowly as if explaining something to a child. Rules are rules. If you don't vacate voluntarily, we'll proceed legally. Margaret went home and cried at her kitchen table. That night, she opened the old cedar chest in her bedroom, the one she hadn't touched since her husband passed. Inside were photographs, war letters, and a thick manila envelope labeled property papers in fading ink. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was the original deed, not a copy, not a reprint. The original dated 1961, long before the HOA existed. It granted the land to her late husband's father and clearly stated that the property was exempt from any future associations, covenants, or governing bodies unless voluntarily joined in writing. Margaret had never joined. The next HOA meeting was crowded. Word had spread that the widow was being evicted. Margaret walked in quietly and handed the envelope to the association's attorney. He read in silence. Then his face changed. He asked for a recess. When the meeting resumed, the board president looked pale. The attorney cleared his throat. This property is not, and never has been, under the jurisdiction of this HOA. Any eviction attempt would be unlawful. In fact, continued harassment could result in legal action against the association. The room was silent. Margaret picked up her papers and walked out without a word. The eviction notice was withdrawn that same day. 2 weeks later, the HOA president resigned. Margaret's roses bloomed brighter than ever that spring, climbing the trellis her husband built, right where it had always stood.